The surveillance footage that changes everything. When video evidence proves systematic conspiracy. When surveillance cameras capture Somali parents dropping children off at daycare centers, leaving within seconds with those same children, and then receiving cash kickback payments in envelopes while the centers bill Minnesota for full days of childcare, you're not witnessing isolated fraud. You're witnessing documented evidence of organized criminal conspiracy involving hundreds of facilities, thousands of participants, and a systematic scheme to defraud taxpayers of billions through coordinated false billing. When Tim Walz appears on camera admitting, "We should have been keeping Minnesotans more up to speed on what was happening," an acknowledgement that he knew about the fraud but deliberately didn't inform taxpayers, you're not hearing a politician apologize for oversight failure. You're hearing a confession of criminal complicity captured on video for federal prosecutors to use as evidence. And when House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer announces his committee will bring state whistleblowers to testify under oath, will subpoena bank records to follow the money, and expects to make criminal referrals at the end of the investigation, you're not witnessing preliminary inquiry. You're witnessing the formal beginning of criminal prosecution that will likely result in indictments, trials, and prison sentences for officials who enabled the largest welfare fraud scheme in American history. This is the story of how surveillance footage from years-old prosecutions suddenly became smoking gun evidence in a national scandal. How Tim Walz's on-camera admission destroyed any possibility of claiming ignorance. How Nick Shirley's threats prove the desperation of a community that knows documentation will end their criminal enterprise. And how Chairman Comer's investigation represents the moment when federal power, armed with video evidence and whistleblower testimony, begins the systematic destruction of the political network that protected Minnesota's fraud for years. The surveillance videos are devastating because they document the fraud mechanism with visual precision that leaves no room for interpretation or excuse. The drop-off scheme. Parents arrive at daycare centers with children. They check the children in, creating documentation that childcare services are being provided. Within minutes, they leave with the same children. The center now has paperwork showing the child was present and will bill Minnesota for a full day of care. The child was never actually in care. No services were provided. The billing is fraudulent. This happens repeatedly, not once or twice, systematically. The surveillance footage shows multiple parents conducting the same routine: arrive, check in, leave immediately with child, center bills for full day. The kickback payments. Additional footage shows a man distributing envelopes of what prosecutors describe as kickback payments to parents who are in on the fraud. This is the crucial detail that transforms individual fraud into organized conspiracy. The parents aren't merely exploiting a system with weak oversight. They're being paid by the daycare operators to participate in coordinated false billing. The operators need children registered to justify billing. The parents provide that registration in exchange for cash payments. The system operates as designed criminal enterprise. The scale. These surveillance videos are from a case prosecuted by Hennepin County, meaning this footage is years old. This scheme wasn't discovered recently. It was documented and prosecuted years ago, which raises the obvious question: if this fraud was documented and prosecuted years ago, how did hundreds of other facilities continue operating the exact same scheme? The answer Minnesotans are discovering. Tim Walz knew about it and chose not to stop it. The most damaging evidence against Tim Walz isn't supplied by investigators or opposition research. It's his own words, captured on video, admitting knowledge and deliberate concealment. "I do believe and I will fully own this. We should have been keeping Minnesotans more up to speed on what was happening." Parse that statement. "I will fully own this." Acknowledgement of responsibility and awareness. We should have been keeping Minnesotans more up to speed. Admission that he knew what was happening but deliberately didn't inform taxpayers on what was happening. Confirmation that he was aware of the fraud while it was occurring. This isn't a politician caught off guard by scandal. This is a governor admitting on camera that he knew about massive fraud and made a conscious decision not to inform the citizens being victimized by it. He continues, We should have been, I think, on a better cadence as you see things that were happening in 2022 as the tools that were given to the administration would get there. This additional statement attempts to frame his failure as communication problems rather than deliberate concealment. But the phrase "things that were happening in 2022" confirms he was aware of ongoing fraud 2 years before Nick Shirley's investigation forced public acknowledgement. The legal implications are severe. When a governor knows about billions in fraud, has the authority to investigate and stop it, and instead chooses to conceal it from taxpayers while the theft continues, that's not negligence, that's conspiracy. Nick Shirley's announcement that he's receiving a lot of threats after exposing Somali fraud is significant for several reasons. Evidence of consciousness of guilt. Legitimate businesses don't threaten journalists who document their operations. Criminal enterprises do. The threats against Shirley provide additional evidence that the Somali community operating these schemes knows they're committing crimes and views exposure as existential threat. Witness intimidation. Threatening someone who has documented criminal activity and is cooperating with federal investigation is itself a federal crime. The FBI investigations that Kash Patel described as surging investigative criminal units into Minnesota will now include investigation of who made threats against Shirley and whether those threats constitute witness intimidation or conspiracy to obstruct justice. Community-wide involvement. The threats suggest that the fraud isn't limited to operators of specific facilities, but involves broader community participation. If only the facility operators were involved in fraud, threats would presumably come from those specific individuals. If the community more broadly views Shirley's investigation as threat, it suggests widespread knowledge of and participation in the fraudulent schemes. Failure of protection. That a 23-year-old citizen journalist conducting legal investigation faces threats while government officials who enabled the fraud face no consequences reveals the inverted justice system that has operated in Minnesota. Shirley documented crimes and gets threatened. Walls concealed crimes and remained governor. Federal intervention is correcting this inversion. The viral video of a Minnesota citizen expressing rage about the fraud captures the collapse of the Minnesota nice culture that enabled years of theft. I want to be proud to say I'm from Minnesota again. We welcome people into this community, into this state, and they're stealing from us. They're stealing from you. I don't care who you voted for. I don't care what political affiliation you claim to be a part of. This child care center fraud is an abomination, and it should upset every single Minnesotan. The key phrase, people that steal from you are not your friend. People that take advantage of you are not your friend, are not a part of your community. This is rejection of the progressive narrative that investigating fraud targeting specific communities constitutes bigotry. This Minnesotan is stating clearly, theft is theft regardless of who commits it, and protecting criminals because of their ethnicity or religion isn't tolerance, it's complicity. And it's time to drop this Minnesota nice BS and start standing up for our state, start standing up for what we believe in so that we can be proud to stand firm in who we are. Minnesota nice, the cultural characteristic of excessive politeness and conflict avoidance, has been weaponized to prevent accountability. Anyone who questioned Somali-operated programs risked being called racist. Anyone who investigated fraud faced accusations of Islamophobia. Better to remain nice than confront obvious theft. But billions in stolen money has limits. Cities can't maintain infrastructure. Services are being cut. Taxpayers watch their money fund luxury cars and cash payments while their communities deteriorate, and the anger building in Minnesota suggests nice has been replaced by demand for accountability. The Quality Leering Center, with learning misspelled as leering on the sign, has become the perfect symbol of Minnesota's fraud because the details are so absurd they would be unbelievable if not documented. 120 violations over 3 years. This facility was cited for more than 120 violations of regulations governing childcare operations. $8 million in federal funding. Despite these violations, from 2019 to 2024, the facility received nearly $8 million in taxpayer money. No proper documentation for children. Among the violations, failure to maintain documentation, proving children were actually present, misspelled sign. The facility can't spell learning, but collected $8 million for supposedly providing education. Still operating, despite 120 violations and obvious fraud, the facility continued receiving funding and remained licensed. This single facility encapsulates the systematic failure of Minnesota's oversight. You don't accumulate 120 violations without inspectors documenting problems. You don't collect $8 million without submitting claims that someone approves. You don't operate for 5 years with obvious red flags without officials deliberately choosing not to investigate. The misspelled sign isn't mere incompetence, it's contempt. These operators knew oversight was so absent, verification so non-existent, that they could misspell learning on a facility claiming to educate children, and no one would care enough to shut them down. Resurfaced video from 2022 shows Tim Walz celebrating Minnesota's refugee resettlement. We're a state of immigrants that values that we have more refugees per capita than any other state. That's not just morally a good thing, it's our economic and cultural future. He describes visiting Worthington and seeing 50 languages spoken in the school, and every storefront filled with different types of foods, different types of businesses. Minnesota needs to continue to do that. The office of governor can set the tone on that. We're going to continue to need to diversify. This video, recorded while the fraud was actively occurring and while Walz was receiving warnings from 400 employees, reveals that his refusal to investigate wasn't mere negligence. It was policy. Investigating fraud would require acknowledging that refugee resettlement created problems. It would mean admitting that diversity in this case meant importing populations that established systematic criminal enterprises. It would undermine the progressive narrative that immigration is always beneficial and questioning it is always bigotry. So Walz chose narrative over accountability. He let billions be stolen rather than admit his refugee policies created opportunities for organized fraud. And he celebrated importing more refugees per capita than any other state, while those refugees established what federal prosecutors now describe as industrial-scale fraud. Even more revealing is resurfaced footage from after fraud had been exposed showing Walz doubling down. Right now our neighbors are being demonized, our neighbors are being terrorized, our neighbors are being picked up off the streets. The antidote to that is positive actions to improve lives that go against what they're trying to do. So instead of demonizing our Somali community, we're going to do more to welcome more in and welcome people back. Read that carefully. After billions in fraud has been exposed, after surveillance footage shows organized kickback schemes, after 100 million people have watched video of empty facilities collecting millions, Walz's response is, we're going to welcome more in. This isn't tone-deaf politics. This is ideological commitment so absolute that reality cannot penetrate it. Walz genuinely believes, or claims to believe, that investigating fraud constitutes demonizing a community, and the proper response is importing more members of that community while enhancing and funding the programs they're defrauding. This explains why investigation was suppressed for years. Walz's worldview cannot accommodate the reality that a refugee community he championed established organized crime networks, so he denied reality, suppressed investigation, and attacked anyone who documented the obvious. House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer's announcement of formal investigation includes specific details that signal serious criminal prosecution rather than political theater. Whistleblower testimony. The most important people are the state whistleblowers, the state employees who put that tweet out that alerted America to the massive fraud. These state employees also alleged that they had warned both Governor Walz and Attorney General Ellison for years that this fraud was occurring, and yet nothing was taking place. So we're going to bring the state employees in. We're going to get their sworn testimony. This establishes several crucial elements. Multiple state employees will testify under oath. They warned Walz and Ellison specifically. They reported fraud for years. Officials did nothing despite warnings. If whistleblowers testify under oath that they reported billions in fraud to Walz and he took no action, and if Walz's own on-camera admission confirms he knew, that's evidence of criminal conspiracy sufficient for federal prosecution. Bank records. We're going to try to identify banks that we can subpoena their bank records so we can follow the money to see how much was taken, who took it, and then who do we need to hold accountable. Bank records will show where fraudulently obtained money went, who received payments from fraud operations, whether political figures or their families benefited. The total scale of theft, Ilhan Omar's unexplained $30 million net worth, becomes very relevant when bank records show money flowing from fraudulent daycare centers through consulting firms to political figures. Criminal referrals. Hopefully, we'll have some criminal referrals at the end of the investigation. Comer isn't describing a fact-finding mission. He's describing an investigation designed to produce criminal referrals, formal recommendations that specific individuals be prosecuted for specific crimes. This means federal prosecution, not state-level charges that Minnesota's Democratic Attorney General might decline to pursue. Federal charges that Trump's DOJ will prosecute aggressively. Comer references a Wall Street Journal op-ed asking, when nearly $250 million can vanish from one state program before anyone truly notices, taxpayers are justified in asking who was supposed to be minding the store? The op-ed's answer, the uncomfortable answer, is that no one elected by the people held that responsibility or held the mandate and clout to stop the scheme. This is damning indictment of democratic accountability. Taxpayers elect governors and legislators specifically to oversee programs distributing tax dollars. That's the fundamental job. When billions vanish and no elected official stops it, the system has failed completely. But the WSJ analysis misses the deeper truth. Someone was minding the store. Tim Walz. He knew about the fraud. 400 employees told him. He chose not to stop it. Not because he lacked authority. Governors have tremendous power to investigate fraud, but because stopping it would undermine his political narrative and anger a voting bloc he relied on. So it's not that no one was minding the store, it's that the person minding the store was complicit in the theft. Comer's most devastating revelation. There was a congressman that came in from Minnesota when I came in 9 years ago to Congress named Jason Lewis. He was talking about the massive fraud from the Somali population 9 years ago. 9 years. Federal officials knew about this fraud 9 years ago. It was discussed in Congress, and it continued because Minnesota's media is very liberal, so they're never going to write anything bad about a beloved Democrat like Tim Walz or Keith Ellison. This timeline means the fraud didn't develop during Walz's governorship. It existed before he took office, was reported to him when he took office, and he chose to let it continue rather than disrupt the political coalition that benefited from it. The surveillance footage showing kickback payments isn't new evidence of new crimes. It's old evidence of crimes that continued for 9 additional years because officials chose protection over prosecution. Elon Musk's accusation that Walz signed legislation allowing illegal immigrants to obtain driver's licenses that can be used for voter registration adds another dimension to the fraud. The fraud isn't just monetary, it's political. If illegal immigrants can obtain driver's licenses in Minnesota, and those licenses can be used for voter registration, and election officials don't verify citizenship, then Minnesota's elections may be decided by populations that shouldn't be voting. This would explain why Walz protected Somali fraud despite political risk. Not just because of direct political support from the Somali community, but because that community's voter registration, potentially including non-citizens, provides the margin of victory in close elections. The state will likely be red if not for all of this. Musk is arguing that Minnesota's blue status is artificially maintained through illegal immigrant voting enabled by fraudulent document programs. If true, this means the fraud isn't just theft, it's election manipulation. Representative Chip Roy's call to pause immigration and reminder that in 1920, when we had a high percentage of people that were foreign-born, we froze immigration for 40 years, and our country vanquished the Nazis in Germany, freed the world, connects Minnesota's fraud to broader immigration policy. Roy's argument, mass immigration without assimilation, creates the conditions for fraud like Minnesota's to flourish. When you import populations faster than they can integrate, when you create welfare programs with minimal oversight, when you make investigating fraud politically toxic by claiming it's bigotry, you create opportunities for organized crime to operate at industrial scale. The 1920s immigration pause allowed time for previous immigrant waves to assimilate, learn English, adopt American civic values, and integrate economically. The result was a unified country capable of tremendous achievement. Current policy does the opposite. Continuous mass immigration, welfare dependency encouraged, integration discouraged, and any expectation of assimilation condemned as racism. The result is Minnesota, a state where entire communities operate fraud networks for years while politicians protect them for votes. Nick Shirley's investigation now has nearly 114 million views on X, up from 100 million days earlier. This isn't just viral content. This is a population larger than most countries seeing documentary evidence of fraud that mainstream media won't cover. Those 114 million people saw empty buildings collecting millions, facilities with misspelled signs operating for years, healthcare providers who can't explain their healthcare operators refusing to answer basic questions, police removing investigators instead of investigating fraud. They drew their own conclusions. They don't need CNN to tell them what to think. They watched the evidence and decided for themselves. Minnesota's government enabled systematic theft and suppressed investigation to protect political allies. This is why Walz is freaking out and faces mass calls to resign. Not because conservative media is attacking him, because 114 million people saw proof he's complicit in fraud, and no amount of narrative manipulation can unsee that evidence. Video of federal agents storming suspected Minneapolis fraud sites and questioning operators shows the investigation moving from documentation to enforcement phase. The agents aren't asking general questions about programs. They're asking specific questions about specific facilities. Are there any subcontractors or anything you guys deal with, like other businesses that you partner with that you use for a service of any kind, maybe transportation or anything like that? They're mapping the network, identifying connections between facilities, building RICO cases that show organized conspiracy rather than individual fraud. This is how federal prosecution of organized crime works. You don't just charge the operator of one facility with fraud. You prove that multiple operators coordinated with each other, that they shared kickback schemes, that they operated as criminal enterprise. Then you prosecute the entire network under RICO statutes that allow for massive penalties and asset seizure. The Somali community that thought political protection made them untouchable is discovering that federal agents with subpoena power, bank records, and 114 million Americans demanding accountability don't care about Minnesota politics. Tim Walz's attempt to claim he would take care of the investigation internally is, as Chairman Comer noted, a joke. No one believes the governor who concealed fraud for years will suddenly investigate himself. No one thinks the official who chose political protection over accountability will produce honest accounting of how much was stolen and who benefited. Federal investigation removes Walz from the equation. House Oversight Committee has subpoena power over state records. FBI agents can raid facilities and seize documents. Federal prosecutors can follow bank records wherever they lead. And none of them answer to Tim Walz or care about Minnesota politics. Walz's on-camera admission destroyed his defense. He can't claim ignorance. He admitted he knew. He can't claim he acted appropriately. He admitted he should have informed taxpayers and didn't. He can't claim the fraud wasn't serious. Federal prosecutors call it industrial scale. All that remains is determining whether his concealment was criminal conspiracy or merely catastrophic negligence. And given that 400 employees warned him, given that he continued funding programs he knew were fraudulent, given that he attacked investigators as racists rather than prosecuting fraud, the evidence points toward criminal conspiracy. The surveillance videos of parents dropping off children for seconds before leaving, of cash kickback payments in envelopes, of systematic false billing schemes, These images will define Minnesota's fraud crisis because they prove intent and organization. You can claim ignorance about statistics, you can dispute interpretations of financial records, but you cannot explain away video of parents and operators coordinating fraud schemes with cash payments. The footage proves this wasn't opportunistic criminals exploiting weak oversight. This was organized conspiracy where parents, operators, and officials worked together to defraud taxpayers of billions while threatening anyone who investigated. And now that 114 million people have seen the evidence, now that federal agents are raiding facilities, now that congressional committees are demanding sworn testimony, the era of protection has definitively ended. Tim Walz admitted on camera that he knew and concealed. The surveillance footage shows why, and Chairman Comer's investigation will determine who goes to prison for the largest welfare fraud scheme in American history. The reckoning isn't coming. The reckoning is here, captured on surveillance cameras, admitted in video confessions, and documented for 114 million people to witness.